December 18, 1942, Port Moresby, New Guinea. The air was thick with heat and the scent of oil. Beyond the cracked runways, the jungle pressed in like a living wall, green and endless. The war had come here months earlier, roaring across the Pacific like a fever, and it was devouring everything: land, sky, men and machines. In a corner of the Allied airfield, a man in grease-stained khakis stood beside a stripped-down civilian aircraft. His sleeves were rolled, his jaw unshaven, and his eyes fixed on the sky as if daring it to defy him. Paul Irving Gunn, Pappy to everyone who knew him, former airline pilot, smuggler, father, mechanic, and the most unpredictable man in the Southwest Pacific. He had no patience for the way the Air Corps did things. Paperwork, approvals, waiting for shipments that never came. Out here, bureaucracy could kill faster than the Japanese. Pappy understood that better than anyone. When he saw his men dying because headquarters refused to send proper planes, he decided to make his own. The others thought he was insane. He took what they called flying coffins, transport planes meant for mail and passengers, and began bolting machine guns into their bellies, wiring triggers where radios used to be, sawing through metal with torches until sparks filled the night. The first time one of his creations took off, the ground crews scattered, unsure whether it would fly or explode. But it rose, slow and stubborn, trailing smoke, like a wounded animal refusing to die. Then Pappy tilted the nose toward the jungle and vanished into the clouds. Hours later, the base heard a new kind of thunder. The same plane returned, riddled with holes but triumphant. Gunn climbed out, covered in sweat and soot, and grinned like a man who just bent the laws of heaven. "She flies," he said. "And she kills." That was how the legend began. Not in the polished halls of command but in the mud, among men who refused to wait for permission. The Pacific War was chaos. Supply lines broke. Commanders argued. The enemy advanced. But in the shadows of the official war, Pappy Gunn was building something the brass would never have approved. An army of hybrid killers, born from junk and desperation, aircraft so brutal and effective that even the Japanese began to whisper about them. He had once flown passengers between Manila and Mindanao, a peacetime cowboy of the skies. But when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, he became something else, a man possessed. His wife and children were captured and sent to a prison camp. For Pappy, the war was no longer about strategy. It was personal. Every bolt he tightened, every barrel he welded to a fuselage, carried their faces in his mind. At Port Moresby, the nights were filled with the roar of engines and the flicker of welding flames. Men from every corner of the Pacific came to watch him work. "You can't turn a cargo plane into a bomber," they said. "It's suicide." Pappy looked up, eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "Then I guess we'll find out who dies first." He started with the A-20 Havoc, then the B-25 Mitchell. The official specs said they were medium bombers, not ground attack aircraft. But Pappy saw potential, space for more guns, more armor, more vengeance. He ripped out the bombardier stations, mounted heavy cannons in their place, and rewired the firing systems with whatever parts he could scavenge. The result was something no manual could describe: a flying sledgehammer. When his B-25 swept low over the jungles of New Guinea, they didn't drop bombs from a distance. They stormed in at treetop level, raking enemy positions with torrents of fire. Pilots began calling them Gunn's ships. Others called them Pappy's killing machines. Headquarters called them unauthorized. But they worked. Convoys that had once moved unchallenged along the coasts now burned in minutes. Japanese airfields vanished under the weight of their strafing runs. For the first time in months, Allied soldiers on the ground looked up and felt hope. Word spread fast. Reporters wrote stories about the mad genius in the jungle. Commanders argued whether to court-martial him or promote him. General George Kenney chose the latter. "We need men who break rules," he said. "As long as they break the enemy too." By early 1943, Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s were the spearhead of the 5th Air Force. They tore through WWII and WWII, flying so low their propellers shredded palm trees. Pilots said they could see the faces of the Japanese soldiers as they fired. It was dirty, close, brutal, exactly how Gunn liked it. He was 43, older than most of the men under his command, but he moved like a man half his age. He laughed at danger, cursed authority, and drank black coffee thick as oil. To the young flyers who followed him, he was more than a leader, he was a myth in motion. Still, every victory carried a shadow. His wife Polly and their children remained prisoners in Manila. Each letter he received from the Red Cross was a ghost of the life he'd lost. When he spoke of her, his voice grew quiet. "They took everything," he said once to a fellow pilot, staring into the jungle night. "So I'll take everything back." Through 1944 his designs became doctrine. Factory-made Strafer versions of the B-25 rolled off assembly lines, built exactly as Pappy had first imagined them. Rows of forward-firing guns, armor plating along the cockpit, side turrets re-engineered for low-altitude assault. What began as one man's rebellion became the blueprint for victory. But Gunn himself never stopped pushing. When engineers said a plane couldn't handle more weight, he added another cannon. When mechanics said the frame would crack, he reinforced it with salvaged steel. "There's no such thing as can't," he told them. "There's only not yet." In late 1944 he flew missions over the Philippines again, the land where his war had started. As his modified B-25s roared across the bays and mountains, he saw the smoke of burning ships below, the shattered cities ahead. Somewhere in that chaos he hoped his family was still alive. The Japanese occupation was crumbling, but the sky remained deadly. Gunn's planes struck at convoys along the coast of Luzon, hammering supply lines that fed the enemy's last defenses. Every mission felt like a step closer to home. On one sortie, his crew recalled him gazing out the cockpit, the setting sun reflecting in his goggles. "If she's alive," he said quietly, "she'll hear us coming." Pappy Gunn never fought for medals. He never cared for orders. What drove him was the sound of engines that shouldn't have flown, weapons that shouldn't have fired, victories no one believed possible. History would remember him as a maverick, a mechanic turned warlord of the skies, the man who took the rules of aerial warfare and rewrote them with a wrench in one hand and vengeance in the other. But for those who flew beside him, he was something simpler, proof that genius and madness often share the same cockpit. If you've made it this far and this story stirred something in you, the defiance, the fire, the sheer will of a man who refused to bow to the system, then subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this deserve to live, just as Pappy Gunn's legacy still roars somewhere over the Pacific, where rebellion once learned to fly. February 1943, the war had shifted. The Allies were beginning to push back across the islands, but every mile of ocean, every strip of jungle airfield was paid for in blood and fuel. The Japanese still dominated much of the Pacific, their convoys moving under cover of night, their fighters fast, disciplined, and merciless. In the humid dark of Port Moresby, Pappy Gunn's workshop glowed like a forge. Sparks hissed from metal as his mechanics, kids barely out of high school, followed his barked orders. "Cut here. Bolt that. Forget the manual's for people who lose wars." They laughed, exhausted, drenched in sweat. They believed in him, though none of them could say why. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, the certainty that everything could be fixed if you were stubborn enough to try. By day, Gunn was grease and profanity. By night, he was a silhouette against the flame, welding, hammering, dreaming. He knew his planes the way a man knows his own scars. He'd flown through storms over Mindanao long before the world caught fire. He'd smuggled contraband, ferried cargo, cheated death a dozen times. The war hadn't made him reckless, it had simply given his recklessness purpose. The brass in Brisbane tried to rein him in. They sent memos, inquiries, requests for clarification. Gunn didn't answer. He didn't have time to explain innovation to men sitting behind mahogany desks. When General Kenny finally arrived in person, he found Gunn lying beneath a gutted B-25, cigarette between his teeth, hands black with oil. "Pappy," Kenny said, "you know you're breaking every rule in the book." Gunn looked up, smiled. "Then it's a good thing we're writing a new one." What he was doing wasn't just repair, it was reinvention. He took the idea of air power and dragged it into the mud where soldiers fought and died. His planes didn't fly high to drop bombs from safety. They swooped low, screaming over treetops, tearing apart ships, trucks, and convoys with torrents of lead. Gunn called it skip bombing, hurling explosives so low they bounced across the water like stones before smashing into enemy hulls. It was madness and it worked. The first major test came in March 1943, in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. 8 Japanese transports, escorted by destroyers, carrying thousands of troops to reinforce La. The Allies had failed to stop such convoys before. They always came through under cover of weather and courage. But this time, Gunn's modified B-25s led the attack. They came in low, barely 100 feet above the waves. The gunners opened fire so close that the sea spray mixed with gunpowder. Bombs skipped across the water, hitting ship after ship. Within hours, the convoy was burning, 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers crippled. Pilots returned white-faced, trembling, alive. The brass called it a miracle. Gunn called it physics. News spread across the Pacific like wildfire. Crews begged to fly gunships. Mechanics copied his modifications by flashlight. Even the enemy noticed. Intercepted radio chatter described devil planes that came from the clouds and never missed. Pappy shrugged off the praise. "We're not fighting for medals," he told his men. "We're fighting because somebody out there thinks they can take our world away." But beneath the legend, the man was wearing thin. He hadn't slept properly in months. Letters from Manila came sporadically, censored and cold. He reread them until the paper grew soft in his hands. His children were still alive, barely. His wife Polly was sick. He would stare at her photograph for long minutes, then turn away and pick up a wrench. Work was the only thing that kept him from breaking. By 1944, the tide of war was turning. Gunn's modified B-25s were now rolling off official assembly lines, christened the B-25J Strafer. The same military that once called him reckless now studied his blueprints. He should have felt vindicated, but he didn't. Each new plane reminded him of the ones that had never returned, the pilots who'd followed his designs into the storm and never come back. He still flew missions himself, always in the lead, always too low. "If I can't see the whites of their eyes," he'd joke, "I'm flying too high." His crews begged him to slow down. "Let the kids take it, Pappy," they said. "You've done enough." But Gunn only smiled that tired, crooked smile. "You stop flying," he said, "you start dying." One dawn in late October, over the Philippine Sea, Gunn led a formation toward a Japanese supply base near San Jose. The weather turned vicious, sheets of rain, gusts that twisted metal. His B-25 shuddered but held. Below, the water flashed with gunfire. He pushed lower into the storm, into the sound. The radio crackled, voices static, then silence. His wingman saw his plane skim the waves, one engine trailing smoke, then vanish behind a wall of cloud. 4 hours they searched. Nothing. No wreckage, no signal, just the endless Pacific swallowing another rebel. For weeks, the men refused to believe he was gone. They said he'd landed somewhere in the jungle, that he'd build another plane out of scrap and come roaring back. The myth of Pappy Gunn couldn't simply end in silence. But it did. When the news finally reached headquarters, there was no funeral, no parade. The war was still raging. There was only a brief note in the records: Lieutenant Colonel Paul I. Gunn, missing, presumed killed. To the men who had flown beside him, it meant nothing. Pappy wasn't a line on a report. He was the reason they were still alive. Months later, when the Allies liberated the Philippines, one of his surviving mechanics found his family. They were alive, thin, haunted, but alive. Polly spoke little about the war, but when she saw a photo of one of Gunn's modified B-25s roaring across the sky, she whispered, "That's him. That's my Paul." In the years that followed, stories of his exploits grew. Some said he once landed on a beach under fire to rescue a stranded pilot. Others swore he built a working aircraft from the wreckage of 3 different planes. Most of it was true. Some of it wasn't. But all of it felt right, because the myth of Pappy Gunn wasn't about accuracy. It was about defiance. He had proven that genius could come from grease and dirt, that courage could look like disobedience, that sometimes the only way to win was to ignore the rulebook entirely. Historians would later call him one of the architects of modern close air support, a pioneer of aerial innovation. But those who truly understood him knew better. He wasn't building machines. He was building hope. In the jungles of New Guinea, wrecks of his planes still lie half-buried beneath vines. Rusted wings, shattered propellers, fragments of invention that changed the course of war. If you stand there long enough, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of engines, the voice of a man shouting through the roar, "We can make it work, just give me a hammer." He was a mechanic, a father, a rebel, a soldier, a man who refused to ask for permission to save lives. And in that refusal, he became something timeless. A reminder that sometimes history is moved forward not by orders, but by those brave enough to ignore them. Pappy Gunn died as he lived, in the sky between chaos and creation. His story is the story of every soldier who chose defiance over despair, invention over obedience, courage over comfort. And as long as planes still fly, his fingerprints will remain on every cockpit bolt, every improvised weapon, every mission that dares to begin with the words, "They said it couldn't be done." If you felt his fire, that spark of rebellion, that raw defiance that built victory out of scrap, then subscribe to the channel. Because the sky still belongs to those who refuse to bow, and somewhere out there, above the Pacific, the ghost of Pappy Gunn still flies, forever chasing the horizon he refused to accept as the end. In the aftermath of victory, the Pacific fell silent. The jungle reclaimed the airfields. The rusted hangars became skeletons swallowed by vines. The sound of engines was replaced by the low hum of insects and rain on tin roofs. But in that silence, the spirit of Pappy Gunn refused to fade. Those who had known him, the mechanics, the gunners, the young pilots who had once followed his lead through the storms, carried his legend back home. To them, he wasn't just another officer lost to the chaos of war. He was proof that one man's will could bend history. In Manila years later, his eldest son, Nathan, would walk through the remnants of Nichols Field, once the beating heart of his father's domain. The air was heavy with memories, the cracked concrete still bearing faint scorch marks from when the Japanese had bombed it. He paused where his father's workshop once stood, the place where wrenches rang like church bells and rebellion took shape out of steel. He could almost see it, the sweat, the laughter, the madness of men trying to make miracles before dawn. Pappy's name began to surface in after-action reports, engineering papers, forgotten memos buried in archives. The official history tried to categorize him, innovator, air tactician, maverick, but none of those words captured the man. He wasn't building theory. He was building survival. The 5th Air Force veterans gathered every few years after the war. They would drink, tell stories, and argue about details, whether it was 6 guns or 8 on the first modified B-25, whether Pappy really flew through a canyon so low he clipped a tree. But the laughter always ended the same way, with silence. The kind of silence that belongs to memory. One of his men, Captain Joe Carmichael, once said, "The colonel didn't just give us planes, he gave us a way to fight when we had nothing left." That was the truth of Pappy Gunn. His machines weren't built from abundance. They were born out of scarcity, rage, and love. Love for the men beside him, for his family imprisoned across the sea, for the idea that freedom was worth breaking every rule to defend. And yet, history has a cruel way of burying the inconvenient. For decades, his story remained a rumor told among pilots, a ghost in the footnotes of the Pacific War. Others received the medals, the promotions, the parades. Gunn's name lingered in the margins, too wild to fit the official version of victory. It wasn't until the 1950s that aviation historians began to trace the lineage of modern gunship design, from the A-1 Skyraider to the AC-47 Spooky, and found his fingerprints everywhere. Every forward-firing cannon, every low-level strike tactic, every audacious blueprint whispered his legacy. The manuals no longer carried his name, but they carried his defiance. Those who studied his work noticed something else. His designs always favored proximity, the human closeness of battle. He wanted the pilot to see what he was fighting, to feel the danger, to understand the cost. To Pappy, war was not a game of distance. It was a confrontation with the truth, that courage had to exist within reach of death. As the Cold War began and the world moved toward faster jets and missiles, the raw spirit of his machine seemed outdated. But then, in the jungles of Vietnam, the old philosophy returned. Young pilots flew low again, slow and brutal, using the very principles Gunn had carved into the bones of the B-25. And though his name wasn't spoken, his ghost was there, in the roar of engines, in the smoke that curled from the treetops, in the unbreakable belief that innovation begins where permission ends. Even in civilian aviation, his influence endured. Mechanics who'd once served under him carried his methods into peacetime, teaching generations of engineers to improvise, adapt, and trust instinct over instruction. If you can dream it, Gunn had told them, you can build it, but you'll have to get your hands dirty first. For his family, the war never truly ended. Polly Gunn raised their children in the quiet strength of a woman who had already seen the worst of the world. She never spoke much about those prison years, but every morning she would light a small candle by the window. When asked why, she said, "For the ones who come home through the sky." His sons grew into pilots, engineers, and dreamers, each carrying a fragment of their father's defiance. One of them, hearing an old B-25 engine roar at an air show decades later, reportedly wept. "That's him," he said softly. "That's the sound of Dad coming home." In the archives of the U.S. Air Force, his official record ends abruptly, "Disappeared over Mindoro, 1944. But between those cold lines of text lies the truth, that his life was never meant to end neatly. Pappy Gunn belonged to motion, to friction, to the wild electricity of creation. If he were alive to see the world now, the sleek bombers, the guided drones, the precision warfare, he would probably laugh. "Pretty," he'd say, "but can you fix it with a wrench in the rain?" His spirit lingers wherever people refuse to accept the impossible. In workshops where mechanics hammer through the night. In runways lit by lightning. In the restless hum of engines waiting for dawn. Every generation of soldiers faces the same question. Do you follow the rules or do you follow the mission? Gunn answered it with his life. He tore through red tape and metal alike, and in doing so, gave others the tools to survive. It's easy now from a distance to romanticize men like him, to call them visionaries, heroes, rebels. But the truth is harsher and more human. Pappy Gunn was a man who hurt, who lost, who burned with a fury so bright it consumed him. He didn't set out to change history. He just refused to let history decide for him. That's the cost of rebellion, the loneliness, the doubt, the silence after the engines stop. Yet even in that silence, his defiance echoes. When the last veterans of the 5th Air Force passed on, their families kept small relics. A wrench, a photo, a piece of shrapnel, a dog tag marked Gunn PI. These weren't souvenirs. They were fragments of belief that a man who refused to bow can still teach us how to rise. So when you hear stories of innovation, of rebellion, of courage forged in chaos, remember that they began here in the Pacific with a mechanic who turned broken planes into killing machines and despair into victory. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe history deserves more than silence, then subscribe. Because men like Pappy Gunn remind us that freedom was never granted. It was built, one rivet, one spark, one act of defiance at a time. And somewhere, far above the waves of the Pacific, where the clouds turn red in the dying sun, a lone engine still hums. Maybe it's just wind, maybe it's memory. But if you listen closely, you'll hear him, the outlaw mechanic, the reluctant hero, the man who taught war how to fight dirty and win. That sound is not the past. It's a promise. The promise that as long as there are people who dare to build, to dream, to resist, the sky will never belong to the powerful. It will belong to the brave. Decades passed and the world moved on from the age of propellers. Jet trails now carved white scars across the same Pacific skies where once the air had trembled under the roar of Pappy Gunn's makeshift bombers. The islands that had witnessed his genius, New Guinea, Mindoro, Leyte, became quiet again. Children played where gunfire once thundered, their laughter rising through the same humid air that had carried the scent of smoke and oil. But history has a way of whispering through the silence. It hides in the rusted ribs of aircraft still half buried in jungle soil, in faded logbooks sealed in attics, in the trembling hands of old men who still dream of the war when they close their eyes. In 1970, a journalist named David Mallory, a veteran of the 5th Air Force who had once been a wide-eyed mechanic under Pappy's command, returned to the Philippines on assignment. He carried with him a faded photograph, Gunn standing in front of AB-25, one boot on the wheel, grin as fierce as the Pacific sun. Mallory wanted to find what was left of that world. He found it in pieces, the warped aluminum fuselages overtaken by vines, the airstrips cracked by time. But in one corner of the jungle near San Jose, he stumbled upon something that made him stop. It was an engine block half buried in the dirt, its serial number still visible through rust. When he traced it later, he discovered it had belonged to one of the planes lost the day Pappy disappeared. There was no wreckage beyond that. No bones. No cockpit glass. Just the heart of a machine that refused to vanish. Mallory sat in the mud for a long time. Then, without saying a word, he pressed his hand against the cold metal. He said later, it felt alive. The story he wrote was published in a small aviation journal. It wasn't front-page news, but among those who knew the legend, it spread like wildfire. Mechanics in Alabama, pilots in Sydney, historians in Tokyo, they all recognized the name. And once again the ghost of Pappy Gunn took flight. In the years that followed, restorers began rebuilding one of his modified B-25s. They called it the Screaming Ghost. It took 5 years, hundreds of volunteers, and thousands of salvaged parts to bring it back to life. When the engines finally started, the crowd fell silent. The sound wasn't just mechanical, it was human. It was the echo of a man who had refused to wait for permission. At the dedication ceremony, an old veteran stood at the microphone. His voice trembled but carried the weight of memory. "We didn't follow him because we had to," he said. "We followed him because he made us believe we could do the impossible. And somehow we did." When the plane lifted from the runway that day, for a moment, it was as if time folded back on itself. The smoke, the noise, the impossible courage of those days returned. It banked low just as Pappy would have flown it, reckless, fearless, defiant. The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed. But somewhere above it all there was only sky, endless, open, indifferent. The same sky that had taken him. The same sky that still belonged to him. Pappy Gunn's life never fit neatly into the categories of hero or outlaw. He was both. He was the man who broke rules to save lives, who turned disaster into design. His genius was raw, imperfect, born of urgency rather than theory. In another world he might have been a professor, an inventor, a father at peace. But his world was war, and war demanded the kind of madness that only men like him could provide. His legacy didn't end with the planes. It lived on in the philosophy of every pilot who refused to quit, every engineer who said, "Let's try it anyway." It lived in the stubborn spark that makes innovation possible, the refusal to accept that something can't be done simply because no one's done it yet. In a letter written months before his final flight, Gunn had scrawled a note to his son on the back of a maintenance log. It read, "Son, if they tell you it's impossible, remember, everything worth doing used to be impossible." That note would become his epitaph, though it was never carved in stone. His grave, if it exists, lies somewhere beneath the shifting tides of the Pacific, his bones scattered with the wreckage of his final mission. But perhaps that's fitting. The ocean was always his element, vast, restless, untamable. Every generation of pilots who has flown since carries a bit of him in their DNA. They may not know his name, but they know the feeling, the heartbeat of the engine beneath their boots, the moment before takeoff when the world seems to hold its breath. That is where Gunn still lives, in the split second between doubt and flight. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because Pappy Gunn reminds us that progress is not born in comfort. It's born in chaos, in the hands of those willing to risk failure, ridicule, and death to build something that works when it shouldn't. He was not a saint. He was not polished. He cursed, he bled, he broke things. But he also built hope from wreckage and courage from fear. In that way he was America itself, flawed, furious, and unstoppable. So when you think of history, don't just remember the polished generals and the neatly written strategies. Remember the man in the hangar, covered in oil, cigarette burning low, hammering salvation into shape. Remember the outlaw who turned chaos into creation. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, not as myths but as reminders of what we're capable of, then subscribe. Because this isn't just history. It's the sound of defiance still echoing through time. Pappy Gunn's planes are gone now, swallowed by rust and memory, but their ghosts remain. Every dawn that breaks over the Pacific carries their hum. Every spark in a mechanic's workshop carries their fire. And every act of rebellion, every moment when someone says, "I can make it work," carries his spirit. He once said the sky was the only place big enough to think clearly. Maybe he was right. Because up there, above the noise, above the rules, above the fear, freedom still sounds like the engine of a man who refused to stop trying. And somewhere, in that eternal blue, Pappy Gunn is still flying, not away from war, not toward glory, but into the endless horizon where all impossible things are born. Years later, when the Pacific had long turned from battlefield to trade route, the name Paul Pappy Gunn lingered like a rumor between waves. Cargo pilots flying from Darwin to Manila still told his story on quiet nights, when the sky turned black and the sea below shimmered like glass. They spoke of the man who turned transports into killers, who defied orders to build salvation out of scrap, who disappeared into a storm and became part of it forever. There were no monuments for him at first. No marble, no statues, no speeches. Only the planes, what few survived, rusting quietly on forgotten airstrips. But legends don't need monuments. They need memory. And memory has a way of surviving where marble cracks. In 1983, a small group of aviation historians gathered at a hangar in Louisiana to unveil a newly restored B-25 Mitchell. It gleamed like a ghost resurrected. On its nose was painted a simple name, Pappy's folly. When the engine fired for the first time, a gust of oil and smoke rolled through the hangar, and one of the men, an old pilot named Harris, whispered, "He's back." That day they flew the plane one last time, low and fast the way Gunn would have demanded. The crowd watched as it roared across the sky, dipping its wings in salute, then vanished toward the horizon. Some swore they could hear another engine behind it, faint and distant, keeping pace in the clouds. In Manila, the U.S. Embassy quietly presented a posthumous citation to his surviving family. The words were formal, bureaucratic, but the meaning was clear: for extraordinary innovation, courage, and service beyond the call of duty. Polly Gunn accepted the medal without a word. She didn't need to hear the speeches. She had lived the truth behind them. Time wore on, and the war receded into documentaries and history books. But in the stories told by veterans, Pappy Gunn remained more than a soldier. He was a challenge, a question flung at every generation that followed. What would you dare to build if no one told you how? In the early 2000s, filmmakers began to rediscover his life. They pored over faded records, letters, and photographs. One image stood out above all others: Gunn standing before a line of modified B-25s, arms crossed, the grin of a man who knew he had done something impossible. That photograph became the opening frame of a new generation's understanding of him. A younger historian, in an interview decades later, described him this way: Gunn wasn't just fighting Japan. He was fighting the system that said improvisation was recklessness. He proved that innovation doesn't wait for permission, it demands it. Today his influence lives quietly in places you wouldn't expect. In aerospace labs, in the philosophy of test pilots, in the culture of engineers who see limits as invitations. When NASA engineers rewired emergency systems to save Apollo 13, one of them reportedly muttered, "We're pulling a Gunn move." In that moment, the spirit of a wartime mechanic reached into space itself. But his story is not just about machines. It's about defiance, the refusal to accept mediocrity when lives depend on brilliance. It's about the strange, almost holy madness that pushes human beings to fight with creativity when everything else has failed. The Pacific Theater was full of men who followed orders. Pappy Gunn was one of the few who created them. When you strip away the medals and the myths, you're left with a simple truth. He was a father trying to save his family, a mechanic trying to save his men, a rebel trying to save his soul. His brilliance was never detached from pain. His genius was forged in the crucible of loss. Every bullet fired from his planes carried the echo of captivity, every victory a whisper of the home he could never return to. And perhaps that's why his story still burns. Because Pappy Gunn wasn't a perfect hero. He was a human one. He doubted, he raged, he broke rules not out of arrogance but necessity. He reminds us that history isn't made by the flawless. It's made by those who dare to act when everything falls apart. Stand in any museum where a B-25 hangs suspended, silver and silent, and look closely at its skin. The rivets, the dents, the patched aluminum, each one tells a story of hands that refuse to give up. That was Gunn's fingerprint. That was his rebellion-made metal. At air shows, when one of those old planes still flies, you can feel it. The ground trembles. The sky vibrates. For a heartbeat, the modern world fades and you're back in 1943, the jungle steaming, the ocean boiling with war, and a man in a torn uniform grinning beneath his goggles, shouting above the engines, "Let's see if she flies." And she always does. That's the legacy of Pappy Gunn, the proof that courage and ingenuity can be one and the same. That sometimes, the most dangerous kind of genius is the kind that refuses to ask for approval. So if his story moved you, if it reminded you of what humanity can do when it's cornered, when it has nothing but imagination and fire, then stay with us. Subscribe, share, tell the next person who thinks the world's too broken to fix. Because once, in the middle of the largest war humanity ever faced, one man with a wrench proved that broken things can still fly. And as the last light fades over the Pacific, as night wraps the waves in silence, somewhere beyond the horizon, you can still hear it, faint, rhythmic, unrelenting. The heartbeat of an engine built by defiance. That is not an echo. It's a reminder that the impossible has always been waiting for someone brave enough to try. And so the legend of Paul Pappy Gunn settled into the bloodstream of history, quiet, steady, invisible but vital. The world forgot many names from that war but has never quite disappeared. It lived in conversations between mechanics over hangar floors slick with oil, in the laughter of pilots trading impossible stories, in the way every veteran spoke his name with a mix of reverence and disbelief. Long after the last B-25 was retired, after the Pacific jungles swallowed the remnants of runways, there remained one thing that time could not corrode: the idea that courage could be built, piece by piece, with bare hands and stubborn will. Gunn's life had proven that invention wasn't just about machines. It was about people refusing to surrender. In 2015, when aviation historians gathered in Oklahoma to mark the centennial of American air power, a restored B-25 was flown across the country to honor forgotten innovators. On its nose was a single word: Pappy. When it landed, the crowd rose in silence. Among them were grandchildren of men who had once served under him, and in their faces there was that same spark, that same mixture of exhaustion and pride that had fueled Gunn's crew all those years ago. After the ceremony, a young cadet approached one of the historians and asked, "What made him different?" The old man smiled. "He didn't wait for orders. He waited for results." That line became a mantra in training schools around the world. Not official, never written into doctrine, but whispered quietly by instructors who understood. Because the lesson of Pappy Gunn was bigger than war. It was about how to live when the world collapses and the rules no longer make sense. Somewhere along the way, his story began to seep into art. A novelist wrote about a pilot haunted by the sound of engines that never stopped. A painter captured his workshop in a storm of orange and blue, sparks flying like constellations. And a documentary crew traced his routes across the islands, interviewing locals who still remembered the mad American, who flew so low they could see his face through the rain. One old fisherman near La recalled the day Gunn's plane strafed a Japanese convoy close to shore. "The sea caught fire," he said. "And in the middle of it, one plane turned and waved its wings, like a goodbye." In that moment, the myth and the man merged. Gunn had become not just a figure of history but a symbol of defiance, of imagination, of the raw, restless hunger that drives progress. But beyond all that, his story is a reminder of cost. Every revolution leaves wreckage. Every act of defiance carries a shadow. Gunn's brilliance saved lives, but it also consumed his own. He gave everything he had to the war, and when it ended he was gone, leaving behind the machines that bore his fingerprints and the silence of a sky that missed him. Polly Gunn lived long enough to see her husband's name recognized in the annals of the Air Force. When asked how she wanted him remembered, she said softly, "Not as a hero, as a builder." Because that was what he truly was, a builder of machines, of faith, of the belief that even in chaos, creation is still possible. If you listen closely to the sound of any engine climbing into the clouds, there's a rhythm there, steady, human, unbreakable. That's him. The outlaw who refused to give up, teaching the sky to sing in a new language. Pappy Gunn's story doesn't end in 1944. It ends every time someone looks at something broken and decides to fix it anyway. It ends every time courage and creativity meet under pressure. It ends every time a rule is broken for the right reason. So, to those who dare, the dreamers, the makers, the ones who work when the world says no, remember this name. Because once, over the endless blue of the Pacific, a mechanic looked at an empty sky and decided to change the way war was fought, the way people thought, the way history turned. He had no blueprint, no permission, only a wrench, a vision, and an unyielding heart. Paul Pappy Gunn, the man who turned desperation into innovation, who made the impossible roar across the sky. If this story reached you, if it stirred something restless in your chest, something that refuses to accept limits, then don't let it fade. Subscribe, share, tell someone who needs to hear it. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to remember and what we dare to build next. And as the credits of the world's longest war roll on, one last image remains. The endless horizon over the Pacific, gold and quiet. A shadow moves across it, wings outstretched, defiant. A single engine hums against the wind, steady as a heartbeat. That sound, that stubborn, beautiful sound, is freedom itself.